Okay, so let's see how far we can get on this set of notes. We didn't have enough to quiz over really anyway. I just wanted you guys to. And apparently I start every single lecture with okay. Have you guys noticed that? It's really obnoxious. Sorry about that. And my son's like, why are you always saying okay? I'm like, I don't know. Why do you always say, does that make sense? Does that make sense? Never listen to audio recordings of yourself. It's a good way to like destroy your self-image. Okay. All right. So we are going to do positive feedback. But first, we were talking last time about intrinsic and extrinsic regulation. I'm going to ask you a couple a couple of verbal questions. For those of you who are type A people, and I know there are a couple of you, who are type A people and are wondering whether you are going to do well. If I ask things verbally and you are generally following along with me and are doing well on the quizzes, that's a pretty good indication of the fact that you're studying the way that I expect you to, okay? The verbal questions tend to be a little, I don't know, a little deeper, a less memorization kind of thing. So first question I want to ask you is extrinsic and intrinsic regulation. We talked about those before. What are they both trying to accomplish? Homeostasis, okay? And if you looked at either of them as a graph, what would they look like over time? Go up and down, and they'll look like a graph of negative feedback, correct? Okay, so now the next question is, well, the next statement is that most organs can do intrinsic and extrinsic regulation, right? And generally speaking, what would they try first? Intrinsic, because it's faster and it's cheaper, right? And then if that doesn't work, you call in the big guns and you do extrinsic regulation, right? Does that make sense? And generally speaking, you will do pretty much whatever necessary because homeostasis is your ultimate goal. The alternative to homeostasis in a human is for you to be a big pile of flesh-colored goo, right? Entropy in humans, like just letting all your variables go to pot, is death. So, and that's not a viable alternative for us. Okay, so most organs can be regulated by extrinsic and intrinsic control. So let's talk about positive feedback for a second. Positive feedback is not homeostatic, okay? But it's always taught in the homeostasis chapter, kind of because it's taught, I think it's because it's taught as a comparison contrast, okay? So with positive feedback, what happens with positive feedback is if a variable is going one direction, for instance, if you are getting too hot, you do something that adds to that, okay? So if you're getting too hot, you don't start sweating to cool yourself down. You start shivering and increase your metabolism to continue on the direction that you were going. Does that make sense? So do you see that that wouldn't be homeostatic? Does that make sense? It's going to push you out of the range, yes? Okay? But and it also doesn't always have to go up. So here's another example of positive feedback. In a positive feedback situation like this, if I nick an artery, what's going to start happening to my blood pressure? It's going to go down, right? It's going to go down because I'm losing blood volume. What's my heart going to do to try to help the situation that won't help the situation? It's going to start pumping harder, which will do what to my blood pressure? Drop my blood pressure further as I lose more blood, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to start going down and I'm going to continue adding to the problem, right? Do you see that that's not homeostatic? Okay, so this is called positive feedback, but again, we have to dump the normal meanings of the word positive. It certainly doesn't mean good, right? And it doesn't always mean up, right? It's just adding to whatever direction you're going. Okay, so when a deviation from normal occurs, what happens is your body makes changes that add to the deviation. In most circumstances, this is a disease situation or an injury kind of situation. So it's not homeostatic. It's not going to maintain your variables. It's generally a disease or a pathology situation. And so let's look at a couple of graphs that will show you examples of positive feedback. Okay, so if we look at positive feedback over time, generally what happens is your variable starts out like it's supposed to. It starts out in a negative feedback situation. So it's always against time. And let's do blood pressure, like we were talking about. And I'm going along, and my blood pressure is doing just fine. I work out every once in a while. It's going up and down. Everything's good. And then I nick an artery, right? And then what happens to my blood pressure goes down. And then my heart rate increases, and what happens to my blood pressure goes down, right? Because I keep losing blood. It goes down and down and down. That makes sense? That's a positive feedback situation. Now, how do those generally end? Well, with that one, it's going to end with some kind of medical intervention, right? You better plug that freaking hole, okay? Or a lot of times they'll end in death, right? This one is an extreme one. Not always with a healthy person is it just medical intervention or death. Sometimes you can catch it, right? So we'll talk about body temperature with that one. So they call these positive feedback loops because you're like adding back in and it's looping back in, or positive feedback amplifications, yeah? You're adding to it, or cascades, positive feedback cascades. So here's body temperature. So this would be what happened in a normal, healthy adult person. Let's say if you got a fever, okay? So this is time, and this is temperature. Normal, healthy adult person goes along and gets a fever. Everything was going just fine, and then they got some kind of pathogen. Let's say it's a nasty one, like meningitis, right? Something that you're not just going to battle your way through. You're going along just fine, body temperature going up and going down, and then you get meningitis, and then your body temperature goes up. And then your immune system kicks into high gear to try to help, right? But what does that do to your metabolism and your body temperature? It increases it. And then as it starts going up, you start losing control, and then you start shivering. And what does that do to your body temperature? It increases it, right? Okay. And if this were almost anything but meningitis and you were otherwise healthy, usually your homeostatic control mechanisms would click in and grab it and pull it back down. But you would be in positive feedback for a little while, right? This meningitis, generally speaking, you're going to need medical intervention, right? They're going to have to come in and at the very least do something to bring down your fever, right? Ibuprofen, cold packs, whatever they're going to do. If it's a bacteria, they can also intervene with antibiotics, right? Does that make sense? So they can do something. Otherwise, it's going to end in an event, which is often death. Does that make sense? So you go into a positive feedback situation, and usually the positive feedback situations will end in events. And the events are medical intervention, death, or your negative feedback control mechanisms will yank it back down. If this were the flu, and you were a 20-something healthy person, it's not very likely that you're going to die, even if you go into positive feedback for a little while, right? Even if, under worst case scenario, and you were a healthy 20-something person, and you went into the flu, right, and your body temperature goes up and up and up and up, and you go up to 104, is it very likely that you are going to wake up, even if it's 48 hours later, with your body temperature coming back down, right? Because your homeostatic control mechanisms are pretty good when you are otherwise healthy. However, at the extremes of your life, when you're very, very young, you know you don't let your children's temperature get to 104. You do not, okay? When you're very old, you do not either. Their homeostatic control mechanisms are unlikely to catch it if you let it go very far. They're just not very good anymore. So with little kids, you guys know who have kids or live around kids, they start getting up to, I don't know what your magic number is in your house, but mine's 101. When it starts getting to 101, 100, I'm like, it's all right, I think you can handle this, you deal. If it's 101, I'm getting out the ibuprofen, and then acetaminophen, I'm preparing, I'm looking at him, see if I can still wrestle him into a cold tub. It's getting harder, he's getting bigger, right? And figuring out, okay, you can't have a glass of wine because you might need to go to the Instacare, right? So you gotta like plan this crap out for the evening, right? You gotta plan it, okay? So, yeah, so those are positive feedback situations. Now, there is a strange couple of situations in the body in which, although it sounds counterintuitive, positive feedback is not homeostatic because it's never going to be, right? When you're in positive feedback, you are going out of the range. Not homeostatic, but is normal. And that is a situation like childbirth, okay? During childbirth, you want it to be in positive feedback because when you get in positive feedback, you go somewhere quickly. And there's nobody, even if they like pregnancy, that will tell you they wanted to be in labor for longer, right? So here's how labor works, okay? If your baby gets to decide when it's ready to be born instead of the doctor who has a vacation plan in Hawaii, which is generally how it happens nowadays, if the baby gets to decide what happens when the baby is fully baked, they will start to release a hormone called oxytocin, which is this one. Right here, a hormone called oxytocin, which causes uterine contraction. But uterine contraction will cause oxytocin release, which will cause more uterine contraction, which will cause more oxytocin release, right? And so they're getting more frequent, and they're getting stronger and more frequent and stronger and more frequent and stronger until pop that thing out of there. Because once you start labor, you are not farting around. You want it done, out, get that thing out, right? Does that make sense? So can you see how that is a normal positive feedback mechanism, but it is not homeostatic, We are not trying to accomplish homeostasis in that thing. We're trying to accomplish an event very quickly. Yes? Here's another example of positive feedback that is normal but not homeostatic, and that is blood clotting. With blood clotting, you nick the wall of a vessel. Let's say it's not an artery, so you're not going to like squirt it everywhere. Just nick the wall of a vessel, and what happens is the damaged vessel wall will attract platelets, which will release chemicals to start clotting, which will also attract platelets, which will release more chemicals to start clotting, which will also attract platelets. You see? See why they're called positive feedback loops or amplifications? Yeah? So, go ahead.
So what happens like if you have factor 5 or something where it just continues to clot? Is it switch not from a positive feedback, or what happens? Or it's just a broken mechanism?
It's a broken mechanism, and we're going to talk about blood clotting when we get to blood. But there's at least 12 different factors, and then they are available in activated features as well. That's 24. 24 different factors involved in blood clotting. Factor 5 is one of them, and if it intervenes, so what should happen with blood clotting is you go positive, 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 and then as soon as it's done, the negative kicks back in. With factor 5, you get stuck, and you can't get the negative kicking back in, and it causes like too much of a positive feedback loop. But we'll talk about that when we get to, do you have that? Okay, we'll talk, make sure you tell me before we do blood, and I'll, don't make babies together, okay? Don't let your children breed.
Mine's a family thing. It's hereditary.
I think hers is hereditary too. Yeah. So don't let your babies breed. That's all I'm saying. Okay. All right. So these when they occur, birth, blood clotting, estrogen secretion is one of them. That's a simple one. Generating action potentials is another one. That one won't make sense to you until I teach you action potentials, but then I will remind you that it's positive feedback. It takes at least 2 days to teach action potentials. Can't do a short form of it. I'm going to put it here, so that when I say, hey, I'm going to teach you this, do you see that this is positive feedback? And you can make a connection. But the estrogen one is pretty easy. Let me show you how the estrogen one works. Estrogen and progesterone secretion. So here's your pituitary gland, anterior pituitary gland, and it secretes this hormone called LH, which is luteinizing hormone, which causes the ovaries to secrete estrogen. Just see if you can tell that it's positive feedback. And then it's a positive feedback, right? It's not an inhibition. So what does estrogen do? It causes the pituitary gland to secrete more LH, right? Which causes more estrogen secretion, which causes the pituitary gland to secrete more LH, right? And by the way, this is going to be that loop up of estrogen secretion that happens during every menstrual cycle, in which estrogen gets really high and then progesterone gets really high, those kinds of things. Is that okay? Okay, all right, so those are positive feedback situations. There aren't very many normal ones. Like I said, most of them are disease situations, vicious cycles potentially leading to death. Okay, so now what I want to do is make sure that we understand the big picture of homeostasis. And why do I spend so much time on homeostasis? It's not because it's the most difficult thing in physiology. It's because it's the most fundamental thing in physiology. So here's the deal. Now you have, I hope, this predictive framework that says that I know what should happen when a variable starts going out of range, right? You know what's going to generally happen. I'm going to generally try to do what to it? Bring it back in range, okay? And I'm going to do it by what mechanism first? What will I try first? Intrinsic regulation, right? And then if that doesn't work, I will try extrinsic regulation. Which effectors am I going to use in the reflex arc? Any ones that I can, generally in the order of cheapest, fastest, first, right? And so you can sort of see this nested approach until you actually accomplish the thing that you want to accomplish. Can you see how that gives you a good predictive framework for what's going to happen with physiology? And so what's going to happen, we hope, is that we are going to flesh out example after example after example of how this is actually happening. And then when there are exceptions, because you know there's going to be exceptions, we will be able to figure out why it's an exception or why it appears to be an exception but isn't, those kinds of things. And then you have a predictive framework that will get you through 85% of what's happening in physiology. Not the details, because you still have to learn the names of things, but like, okay, I understand why it's working that way. Now I just got to learn all the names of it, right? So that's the ideal in phys. You're like, I know what should happen. Now I need to fill in the details and make sure it adheres to my prediction. And if it doesn't adhere to my prediction, what I do, I tweak the framework so it's slightly better, right? That makes sense? Okay. So let's talk about what we mean when we are talking about homeostasis. Is of course the unifying theme of physiology. It is your biggest predictor. And we already talked about what's generally monitored and regulated as your extracellular fluid. Yes? And what kinds of variables do you regulate? What kinds of variables you got? That's what you regulate. Everything that you can imagine. Because we know that if we stop regulating our internal body temperature, it will equal the external temperature, right? And then you're dead. We know that if we stop regulating our pH, it will equal whatever the environmental pH is, and then you're dead. Okay? We know that if we stop regulating our glucose concentration, our brain will die, and then you're dead. So you can see what the alternative to regulating your variables are. So you regulate body temperature, you regulate blood pressure, you regulate concentrations of so many things that you never even thought you were regulating. Ions, pH, glucose, carbon dioxide, everything has regulation mechanisms that you're working on. So now just some terms to make sure that your lab, your textbook, and me, we're all in agreement so that you can understand the terminology and how it applies to each other. So first thing is, we always say that the body maintains a relatively constant internal environment. But do I mean constant as in unchanging when I say constant? No, you don't. I think of what the body does as maintaining a variable within, it sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not, within predictable variability. Do you understand what I mean by I know it's going to vary, but I can predict about how it's going to vary? Which means I don't even need to know you, but I know that if I look at your body temperature over the course of a day or a month, I can promise you it's not going to go down to 66, and I can promise you it's not going to go up to 120, right? So do you see how it is predictable variability? I know it's going to do this, but it's going to do it within a range that I can predict. I may not be able to predict any specific moment your body temperature, but I can certainly predict the trend, yes? So I call it predictable variability. And then, so we got to figure out what we mean by constant and what terms are used to describe it. A lot of times your textbook, and I think your lab book, although I haven't looked at it this semester, your lab book and your textbook use the term steady state. Steady state? Okay. So basically, instead of maintaining a set point, I maintain a steady state, which is I'm wiggling, but I'm wiggling in a predictable way, right? So it's basically describing what that negative feedback graph would do if it didn't go into positive feedback there, right? If we were looking at negative feedback over time. So a steady state is the maintenance of a regulated variable within a healthy range, and this requires tons of energy, because you're just going to equalize with your environment if you don't put in energy, right? Just think about the temperature of your home. What will it be if you don't put in energy? It will be exactly the same as the external environment, right? Your body would do that as well with all of its variables. So it is the most expensive thing that you do over the course of any day, right? Unless you're running a freaking marathon that day, I promise you it's the most expensive thing that you will do. It's anywhere between 60 and 70% of the ATP that you use over the course of a day is just maintaining homeostasis. Okay, it's very, very energetically expensive. So the set point is the ideal value of any regulated variable, but there is no way for me to say, hey, hypothalamus, tell me what number you have in mind. It doesn't communicate in a way that I can understand. Do you see? There's no way for me to pull the set point out of there. So the way that I calculate, estimate what I think the set point is to get good data over time and then average it. So the mean, do you see, or average, is the best indicator that you can ever get of the set point. You guys with me on that? Okay. It may not be exactly, but the more data you get, the closer you will get to the actual set point. You guys with me? So for instance, would I get your true body temperature set point if I took his body temperature every morning at 8 a.m. for 30 days? No. I would get his 8 a.m. body temperature. What do I need? I need data varying over time. The more data points, the better indicator you will get, right? And so you guys have been working on that kind of thing over the last week, right? With the Circadian Rhythm Lab. So what you're trying to figure out is something about your ranges and your means. And it will give you an insight as to what your set point is. But if you don't have very much data, you're not going to get a good idea of what your set point is, right? And if you refuse to wake up at 4 a.m. and you just make up the number and write it down, which I know some of you guys are doing, don't even look at me. I know, right? See, Brad? Then you're not going to get your set point right. Okay, so the set point is the ideal value of a regulated variable. It's in you. I don't know how to extract it. You've got a different one for temperature than I do. You've got a different one for blood glucose than I do. But the mean is the average value of the regulated variable over time. And of course, the range is the minimum and maximum over time, right? Okay, so you guys tell me, does your body, and think about this, actually maintain a set point, maintain your variable at a set point or in a steady state? Yeah, because step point is really expensive. I want you to think about what would happen if your body was actually trying to maintain exactly 98.6. That means every time it got to 98.7, you would, for instance, start sweating. And every time it got to 98.5, you would start shivering. Can you see? Oh, God, it would be horrible. That's what the flu feels like, isn't it? The flu does feel like that. It's like, oh, I'm sweating, I'm shivering, I'm sweating, I'm shivering. But it would also eat up every single bit of nutrients and ATP that you had, right? So you have to say, this is what I have in mind, but this is okay, right? Which is kind of what you do with other humans, right? It's like, this is what I had in mind, husband, but this is okay, right? It's how you stay in a relationship. It's what I got in mind. You're just accepting homeostasis. You're like, this will do. It's fine. Okay, marriage. I know, I'm really romantic. That'll do. You'll do. Okay, but just so you know, they're doing the same damn thing with you. It's not like, oh, you're my ideal. Because his ideal, I think, is Mila Kunis, but he got me. So there you go. Okay. Which is more likely to be useful information, especially in a clinical situation, about any given variable? Clinical situation, you're going to be talking to a doctor, a medical professional, or a patient. Which is more useful information for you to know? The set point, the mean, or the range? The range. Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not as easy to memorize, right? Because it's two numbers, right? At the very least, not one number. But just so you know, of course, intuitively, you know that you do not want to be the person who calls the doctor when somebody's blood pressure. It's not 120 over 80. Oh no, it's 129 over 87. Call the doctor, right? You know better than that. You do not want to embarrass yourself. But there is an unacceptable blood pressure either end, correct? Okay, especially, but even if it's relatively high, even if the person's blood pressure is like 200 over 160, they might look like they're about to burst a gasket, but before you call the doctor, you probably better ask them if they ran up the stairs. All the stairs on the way there, right? Okay, and then see, so intuitively you know this stuff. So what's going to happen, depending on what you do with your career, is you will end up memorizing the ranges that you deal with all the time, right? If you're a nurse, you're going to know normal blood pressure ranges, right? Because every freaking nurse everywhere takes blood pressure, right? If you work in OBGYN, you will probably also be able to memorize glucose ranges, right? Because you're going to be dealing with that with pregnant moms, thyroid hormone ranges, those kinds of things, progesterone ranges, those kinds of things. But if you're working with diabetics, you're going to memorize glucose ranges, and you're going to look at some like ketone bodies and other kinds of things that you look at. Does that make sense? Okay, so do I have all of them memorized? Nope. I know where to find them, though, okay? And that's what you're going to be like with most ranges, right? Okay, so last bit about variability. So we've basically been accepting the fact that variability within an individual over time is absolutely normal, okay? But is variability between individuals also normal? Yes, variability between individuals is also normal. But the mean in an individual over time is relatively constant, okay? If I get enough data, I can get a good idea of your mean body temperature, and it's relatively constant. Does it change, though? Yeah, it does change over time. For instance, you know, in the middle of the winter, when you set your thermostat slightly down because it's okay and it's less expensive. So in the middle of winter, you set your thermostat to, I don't know, somebody in the last class said she set hers at 50 in the winter. I was like, I am not coming over, okay? Because I don't know you well enough to cuddle with you. So, mine is set at 68 in the winter, okay? Because it's acceptable and it's less expensive, right? And then in the summer, I'm sorry, I do not understand people who have swamp coolers. I have freaking 2 air conditioners in my house, and I still set mine only up to 72. And I drive a hybrid car, so shut up. So I set it up to 72 because that's in the range and it's less expensive. Your body does the same thing, and you actually can feel it when it happens. You know when it gets hot every year? It starts getting hot, and you think, oh my God, why do I live in Utah? This blows. I can't believe it. And it's so hot. It may only be 88 degrees, but it's so hot. You can't handle it. You're sweating. It's gross. And then it's like doesn't get cool, right? And then eventually what your body says is it's really getting hot and you're staying in Utah. Really? Honestly? I mean, we've talked about this, right? You hate this every year. And then it's like, oh, okay. And then it just moves up your body temperature a little bit. And then you don't sweat as much and you're not as uncomfortable. Same thing happens every time when it gets cold, right? It's cold. I can't believe I live here. This blows. What's happening? Oh my God. And then you're miserable for about 2 weeks. And then you change your set point. So why don't you change your set point after a single day?
Because sometimes it's not going to be cold every day.
It's not going to be cold every day. So what you have to do is the set point, if you change it every freaking day, it's just as good as having no set point at all. So what happens is it's got to be efficient for you to change it one way or the other. So it asks for like constant input over a period of time. Your period of time is probably different than mine. My body temperature usually resets after about a couple weeks, right? Some people it takes a little longer and they'll be sweating like crazy for a month. But still you have to have a relatively constant input for it to say, really? Do we really need to do this? Are you serious? Like serious? And then it does it, okay? And you can understand. I mean, it's just like setting your thermostat. You don't change that every day either, right? Because it's really expensive to do that. Okay, so that, by the way, we're going to talk about that concept again in just a second, but it's called adaptation or accommodation. It's the ability to change your set points and ranges with different environmental input, and it's a little further down in the notes. So let's talk about, it's right here, adaptation and acclimatization. So let's talk about bodily processes related to homeostasis because you guys have been doing this in lab. So your biological rhythms that vary over a 24 or 25-hour cycle are called circadian rhythms. Circa means around, like going around the clock. That makes sense? So the ones that vary over a 24 or 25-hour cycle are called your circadian rhythms. And those will make sense to you, like your sleep-wake cycles, your body temperature cycles will vary over those kinds of things. Your hormone concentrations, not sex hormones, those don't tend to vary that much over the course of a day, but like sugar regulating and metabolism regulating hormones like thyroid hormone and like insulin and glucagon and cortisol, those are regulating metabolism and nutrient levels. Those vary over the course of a day. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. And if you're really, really, really regular, what happens is, of course, your circadian rhythms have a really predictable pattern, right? And so with a good person who's not a good, you're not better than me just because you're really regular in your sleep-wake cycles. I mean, with the person who has really, really regular sleep-wake cycles, then they're going to get the full benefit of anticipatory homeostasis, right? Which is the feed-forward mechanism, which means that if you go to bed every single night at 11 o'clock, you're going to get freaking sleepy at 10:30 no matter what you do. And if you wake up every morning at 6, you're going to get, your body is going to start waking you up at about 5:45 or 6 every morning, right? That's anticipatory homeostasis. So how does your body know 24, 25-hour cycles? Well, the best assumption is that the 24, 25-hour cycles evolved with us as we evolved on this planet with 24, 25-hour day-night cycles, right, as our planet spins. So I assume that if you evolved on a different planet, you would have a cycle that was something like that. But we have no other indication. So, but there is something interesting that if you put a person in isolation or an organism in isolation, like someone who has in solitary confinement with absolutely no input for light or temperature and no temperature and light variation, they will still adhere to a 24, 25-hour cycle, even though it doesn't adhere to the day-night cycles anymore. What happens with you to keep you timed on the day-night cycles is you have sensory input, which tells you day versus night, and the sensory input goes, of course, from your eyes, because generally lighter in the daytime. I mean, people get screwed up in the poles, right? We know that. But if you're living on the North or South Pole, you got other problems too. You got light input, but then you've also got temperature input, right? And the temperature input is usually warmer in the day and colder at night, right? And so they use that to sort of set your clock, your internal clock, your body clock. And then what the hypothalamus does is the hypothalamus gathers all that data and regulates your metabolism based on that, and it also regulates the pineal gland. I don't know if you guys remember that the hypothalamus is just up from your pituitary gland, right? And then the pineal gland is just posterior to that, like just behind the thalamus. So the pineal gland releases melatonin. The hypothalamus tells it when to do that. And melatonin in humans is related to your sleep-wake cycle. So you release melatonin right before 30, 45 minutes before you fall asleep every night, especially if you're very regular. Does that make sense? So you release melatonin and it slows you down, slows down your metabolism, and then you get sleepy. And then your melatonin level drops during the night, and then eventually your metabolism is going to go back up, right? So the hypothalamus is basically the sort of integration center for your day-night cycling, yeah? And it controls the pineal gland. Is that good? Okay, so we already talked about adaptation or acclimatization and how that's related to homeostasis, but let me add a little bit more detail to that. What adaptation or acclimatization is you can change your set points and ranges based on varying environmental constraints, right? If the environment changes, you can change as well. So let me give you another example of this. I moved from Texas to Utah. I've been here about 12 years. Anybody else moved from someplace that's like low elevation? Really low elevation? Okay, so did you notice that you couldn't walk up a flight of stairs when you got here without freaking dying? Okay, it was terrible. So you guys probably know this, but I'm explaining it. Just forgive me if I'm being redundant. But lower elevation areas have much higher oxygen availability in the air, and therefore they don't need as many red blood cells. Got plenty of oxygen. You don't need as many oxygen ferries carrying it around. Yeah, but when you're at really high elevation, you tend to have lower oxygen availability in the air, right? So you need comparatively more red blood cells. But what happened to those few of us who moved from lower elevation to high elevation is when you move here, you have low levels of red blood cells and low levels of oxygen in the air. So every friggin' time you walk up the stairs, you think you're gonna die, right? You're like, oh my God, I cannot live here. And if you compound that with the fact that I moved from Texas without knowing what the hell I was doing to Provo. You know they don't like me in Provo. I could make a friend to save my life. I'm like, well, nobody's talking to me and I cannot even walk up the stairs. I hate Utah. I'm going home. What happened is I was like miserable for 2 weeks because I couldn't breathe, right? And then all of a sudden my body's like, you're staying? Really? You're staying like in Provo? Really? I'm like, I already have a job, body. So yeah, I decided to stay. And then what happened is my body said, okay, I'm going to up your set point and range for your red blood cells, right? And then it upped my set point range, and then at least I could walk around. I still didn't have any friends, but I could walk around. I could walk around. And what? I could walk up the stairs. I went to Target in Provo. This was the first semester here. First of all, this happened in the beginning of my first semester here. My boyfriend, whose husband lived in Provo. But I moved to Provo, and one of the first things that happened in the first few weeks that I was here was that I was in Target in Provo, and a lady like in the grocery store line asked me why I didn't have children. And I was like, is that a thing you ask people? I was like, why do you have children? I mean, this is my default, right? I came this way without children because I'm like 30-something, supposed to have children. I mean, did she really want me to tell her that I didn't have a uterus or something? Like horribly uncomfortable like that? I know. I wish I had thought of it. I never think of clever things like that at the time. It's always afterward. Hey, wait, what if I didn't have a uterus? I don't do that. So that happened. And then at the end of the semester, one of my first reviews that I got when I was here was she should wear more makeup and she needs to wear skirts and heels. I was like, I just moved to the 1950s. That's where I did. And so I decided to become the most vocal liberal you have ever known. Yay! The vocal minority. So I'm just mouthier now. That's all that did to me. He didn't make me wear heels. I'm just mouthier. That's all. Because I'm the son of it. I'm the daughter of a hippie. Okay, so adaptation and acclimatization. Aging, by the way, is when your homeostatic control mechanisms start to fail you and become really inefficient. And that means when you go out of range, you don't catch it very quickly, right? and you tend to accumulate damage when you stay out of range for a while. So what happens as you age is when you're in your prime, your homeostatic ranges go like that. And as you age, they go out, they stay out for a little longer than they should have, and you get a little damage, right? And then they go back in. Stay out for a little longer than they should have, and you get a little damage, right? Does that make sense? And so progressively, your control mechanisms just sort of start to fail you as you age. Go ahead.
Is there an average age that starts?
Nope.
It depends on your health.
It depends on your health and your genetics. It's primarily the health of your cardiovascular system. Okay. So do you know the secret to long and healthy life?
Try everything.
Oh my God. It's diet and exercise. And I wish I had another answer for you because I would be so rich. But it is totally diet and exercise. And I keep looking, all the books, but no. Do you know how you stay hot forever? You don't. Sorry. But do you know how you keep from becoming a big pile of goo that costs everybody a lot of money with your medical problems? Diet and exercise. That's what you do. And I wish I knew some other way around it because I would be so amazingly hot. Okay. So now let's talk about upregulation and downregulation. But diet and exercise suck, right? All the good stuff tastes bad. And it's not fun to exercise. I don't know what's wrong with you people. It's not fun. I just sit there going, I hate this. I hate this. This sucks balls. Why does it? So I hate it. Okay. So upregulation and downregulation. Let's talk about this one. This one's an interesting concept, and it comes back a lot, and it sort of makes you think about this stuff a little bit more deeply. So here's the deal. What if there's a variable that I'm trying to regulate over time, and I cannot regulate it for whatever reason? Okay, so let me use a simple example first, and then I'll give you a complex one. So let's say we've got a male, and he has chronically low levels of testosterone. Okay, and I know we think of testosterone as only related to sexuality, but it's also related to maintaining muscle mass. It's related to brain function. It's related to maintaining bone mass. It's related to metabolism. It's related to a bunch of different things, and sex drive. But we've got a male with chronically low levels of testosterone, and what happens is over time, not weeks, not months, let's say years, his body tries to regulate the testosterone level to keep it up in the normal range, but whatever, there's something wrong. He can't get it the level high enough because maybe there's an enzyme that's not produced adequately or something. So can you see that plan B over a very long period of time might be if you fail to regulate the variable, testosterone level, you can, plan B, regulate the response to the variable, like the receptors on the cells for testosterone, right? Okay, so here's the deal. Chronically low levels of testosterone, if I cannot regulate them, what might I do to the target cells for testosterone? Might I increase the number and sensitivity of the receptors on the target cells for testosterone, or decrease the number and sensitivity? Increase, right? So a distant plan B is if you fail to regulate the variable, you can regulate the target cell response to the variable. Do you see why that would be a very distant plan B? Okay. I have no idea what I said. Whenever people say that, I have no idea what just came out of my head holes. I was like, what did I say? Okay, so if you fail to regulate the variable over a long period of time, you can regulate the response to the variable. Does that make sense? So if I have a male who has chronically low levels of testosterone and you cannot, and you've tried over a long period of time to make more testosterone, then what happens is you will upregulate, they call it upregulation, the target cell response to testosterone. And you generally do that by making more receptors or increasing the sensitivity of the receptors. So do you see that you can still get a relatively normal response with abnormally low levels? Right? Does that make sense?
It just makes it more effective.
Well, it makes the impact on the body of having low levels of testosterone less dramatic, right? You still have low testosterone, but you're going to be more responsive to the testosterone you have. Does that make sense?
Is it just because there's more receptors for the...
More receptors, right, exactly.
Because there's not enough
Because there's not, we tried the testosterone level, and we've been trying that for years, right? And we failed miserably at that. And so finally we gave up on the testosterone level, and we said, okay, how about we just make you more sensitive to the testosterone that you have?
So making it more efficient, basically.
It's not efficient. It's still trying to get into homeostatic norm, only we gave up on the variable, and now we're working on the response, right?
Okay.
That makes sense? Go ahead.
So your body will just naturally do that?
It will over time. Yes. And what time, it really depends on you, right? But you can see that that would not be something you would want to change instantly. Generally speaking, in order to give up on regulating a variable, it's going to have to be a really long time for you to try to regulate the variable, okay? So, and that's different with you and it's different with me, okay? But now, that, by the way, is called upregulation, okay? And before I go any further, upregulation would be a response to, fill in the blank, chronically high or chronically low levels of a variable? Low, yes? Okay. So now let me give you an example of downregulation that you're going to run into if you do anything related to human health. Okay. Downregulation, so with downregulation, what happens is you are going to be responding to chronically high levels of a variable by downregulating, right? Does that make sense? Chronically high, and you can't control them, levels of a variable, and in order to keep the cell response normal, even though the variable is high, you are going to decrease the number and or sensitivity of the receptors. You guys with me? Okay, so this example is really complicated, but it's not super complicated, but it's really true, and you're going to run into it. So let's try to get the relationship. Okay, so in the United States, we have incredibly high rates of type 2 diabetes. Okay, and type 2 diabetes is almost invariably related to your diet and exercise patterns. And this is how you generally get type 2 diabetes. If you've got a family history of it, you better be more careful than the rest of us. But even if you have a family history of it, I can pretty much guarantee that if you work out and eat well, you will not get it, even if you have a family history of it. Because it's not the skinny people in your family, right? The skinny people, what?
What happens when you do get it?
I'll talk to you just a second. Okay, so let me tell you how you get it. Okay, with type 2 diabetes, here's how it happens. So let's use Mississippi. Fattest state in the union, right? Okay, it is the fattest state in the union. Yep. It is. Have you not been to Mississippi? Oh my hell. All you have to do is go to Mississippi and all of a sudden you're the hottest person you've ever seen. That's why I work out at the JCC. They're all 85 and I'm like, I am good. I am so good. You just walk in there. It's all, you got to just get yourself used to what's around you. In Mississippi, anyway, so let's do the Mississippi diet plan. The Mississippi diet plan is going to be drinking lots of Dr. Peppers. And some beer too, but Dr. Peppers are going to really screw with your blood sugar. And eat some fried food, and then you're almost never going to exercise. As a matter of fact, at Walmart, you have one of those little things that you take around Walmart just because you're fat. All right, so exercise, by the way, is a really, really effective way to lower your blood sugar because your muscles take in sugar even in the absence of insulin. So it lowers your blood sugar in the absence of insulin. So it's a really good way. So chronically high levels of processed sugars and chronically low levels of exercise are the recipe for type 2 diabetes over time. I have no idea how long it's going to take you to get that, and sometimes some people won't. But here's what happens. Eat a whole bunch of sugar. What your body will do is release insulin to try to bring down your sugar level. Yes? Okay. But I'm not going to let it do that because I'm going to drink another Dr. Pepper, right? And then my sugar level is going to go up and my insulin level is going to go up, right? And then I'm going to drink another Dr. Pepper, and then my sugar level is going to go up and my insulin level is going to go up, right? And then I'm going to drink another one because I'm going to have 6 to 8 Dr. Peppers over the course of the day, okay? And so what happens is over years, 10 years maybe, 15 years, I don't know, what happens is your body is constantly trying to regulate the sugar-insulin relationship, but it's failing because you just keep putting sugar into the system, right? And so what's going to happen over time is you are going to continue releasing massive amounts of insulin, and eventually your cells are going to say, lay off with the insulin here. I can't handle any more sugar inside my cells, right? And so their mechanism of lay off with the insulin cannot control how many Dr. Peppers you drink. It's not going to control that. But what it will do is start to downregulate the number and sensitivity of insulin receptors on the target cells, right? Do you see what happens over time? Because you are constantly bathing your cells with sugar, insulin, right? Okay? And so what you do is you downregulate the cellular response to insulin, okay? So why is that bad? The reason that's bad is because now you do not respond to normal levels of insulin. So in between those times when you're drinking those 6 Dr. Peppers, like when you're sleeping and those kinds of things, your sugar levels crash and they go high, and then they crash and then they go high, and then they crash and then they go high. And during those crashes, all of those portions of your body that need sugar are cut off from sugar. You cannot regulate your blood sugar levels. and you start to get things like diabetic neuropathy and amputations and blindness and all of those kinds of things going on. Okay, does that make sense to you guys? So what you're doing is you're responding to chronically and uncontrollable high levels of insulin, right, with downregulating your insulin receptors. Okay, does that make sense? So when you go into the doctor and they say your insulin and your sugar levels are high, they may say you're borderline diabetic. Luckily, at that point, you can very easily, almost always, flip it back by changing your diet and exercise patterns, right? Changing your diet and exercise patterns. But most people won't do that because just because you are borderline diabetic does not mean you feel bad, right? And so then they go in later and then they are actually full-blown type 2 diabetic, right? And they still don't want to change their diet and exercise patterns. And then they ask you for a pill, and there are pills that can help you regulate your sugar level, but they are not very effective. They regulate it so that it doesn't go as extreme, but they don't regulate it as well as like your body could regulate it. And then the long-term negative that can happen from this is death. Diabetes is incredibly hard on your cardiovascular system and your kidneys especially, also your brain. But a type 2 diabetic who does not regulate their insulin and sugar levels with diet and exercise can become a type 1 diabetic. But then you are an insulin dependent, meaning now your pancreas just said, screw it, I give up on you, I'm not making you any more insulin. Insulin resistant diabetic. So now, in order to get the normal response to insulin, you have to inject 2 and 3 times the insulin to get the normal response. Okay? Very, very hard on your kidneys, very hard on your body, incredibly expensive. I personally think if we have like sin taxes on alcohol and cigarettes, food that makes you fat and sodas should have taxes on that because I'm paying for those people's medical insurance, and that pisses me off, man. I'm like, if you're going to get fat, you pay for your fat self. You go do that. I don't care. I mean, all of us would be fat, right? If you didn't want to get laid, you'd probably be fat, really, honestly. It's like, it's way better.
I have one question.
Go ahead.
For example, if I drink like soda, but I still go to gym and do exercise,
Mm-hmm.
it can help to...
Oh, yeah, it does help a lot. Yeah, but sodas are pretty much the worst thing you can drink. They're way worse than alcohol, just so you know. Sodas are terrible. Absolutely no nutritional value, tons and tons of calories. High fructose corn syrup is way worse for your metabolism than regular sugar. Go ahead.
Would hypothyroidism be another example?
It can be, but hypothyroidism takes a while to explain. It sometimes will do this. Okay, so what time is it? 45. Okay. All right, so the next thing that we're going to start is how you do this regulation. We know that you do it by intrinsic and extrinsic regulation, but here's the deal. You have 100 trillion cells, and they don't all do the same thing, right? But they've all got the same big goal, which is homeostasis. But your liver does liver stuff like get rid of toxins, and your skin does skin stuff like protect from UV radiation. And they need each other, right? But in order to maintain body-wide homeostasis when you've got specialized cells, do you understand that necessitates the need for communication? Do you see that communication is necessary? And so now we need to talk about how cells communicate. How they communicate, if I'm cell A and she's cell B, but I have to stay in the liver and she has to stay in the skin, we communicate via chemical messengers. And chemical messengers are things that I send from one cell to the other, right? And specifically, we call them intercellular, meaning what? Between the cells, intercellular chemical messengers, right? Okay, so if I want to talk to her, she can only hear me if she has a receptor for me, right? And so if she has a receptor for the chemical messenger that I release, then we call her a target cell for the chemical messenger, yes? Okay, and so as cells become specialized, they have to be able to communicate with one another in order to maintain body-wide homeostasis. And you accomplish that by releasing chemical messengers, which go from the cell that releases it to the target cell. And then the target cell has to do something in response to it. So let's say the skin cell said, hey, I just took in an environmental toxin accidentally on the surface of my skin, right? I just accidentally absorbed some lipid-soluble toxin, and I need you to get rid of it, right? So if I tell her to get rid of it, that's all well and good, but she didn't do it yet, right? Does that make sense? She didn't actually accomplish the goal yet. She just heard the command. So how she accomplishes the goal is called the target cell response pathway. It's the mechanism by which she accomplishes the goal, or sometimes it's called the signal transduction pathway. And we're going to talk about those in detail when we get to the endocrine system. But basically, there is a series of steps inside her that has to happen in order for her to accomplish the goal. And it's kind of like playing telephone. Like if the receptor is on the cell surface, but the thing that needs to actually do the responses in the nucleus, she has to like talk to one thing inside the cell, and then it has to talk to another, and then it has to talk to another one, right? Until you actually get the response. It's kind of like playing telephone. So like if I were testosterone, and he were a muscle cell, okay, I'm testosterone, I'm a chemical messenger that's going to be released from here to here, right? And what testosterone does is causes you to build more muscle proteins inside muscle, actin and myosin. So what has to happen is I bind to the receptor on him, right? And it says, hey, do protein synthesis of actin and myosin. And then what happens is he initiates that chain of things that results in protein synthesis. And you know protein synthesis is complicated. You did it in 1610, right? It's got some nucleus, some mRNA, some ribosomes, some cleavin, and all that business. That's how you would do actin and myosin. So the process that happens inside the target cell to cause the response is called the signal transduction pathway, or the target cell response pathway. I always think of it as playing telephone inside the cell. You guys have played telephone when you were little, right? Somebody like whispers in somebody's ear, and then they tell that person, they tell that person, they tell that person, and you look at what comes out at the other end. Hopefully in cells it works better than it does in kindergarten, because that crap does not work at all. There's some amazing stuff that comes out. I love playing that with the kids in kindergarten. Okay, so we will stop there, and that's where your quiz is going to stop for Friday. Mm-hmm. If you have a clicker that I haven't got. How was your vacation?
It was
Sucker.
lovely. Got nice and tan.
It's a good thing I like you. Missing class for a week. You're not sorry.
I'm sorry that you guys didn't get a chance to experience with me.
Adolfo, come give me your clicker number, please. What's your last name?
HUIDOBRO.
Can you read me the device ID?
AD6329.
AD6329?
AD6329.
Okay, good.
What channel am I supposed to say?
41. 41. Tranter?
Yep.
What's your device ID?
107 DCA.
DCA?
8.
Or 8. 107 DC8?
Yep.
Okay, good. What is your last name? I'll make sure I... Anderson? Oh, I didn't get your email. What is it?
B3513B.
13B. Let me read it again. B3513B? Yes? Okay.
Did you get my email?
I don't know. Let's check. What's your last name? No, I don't have it in there.
It's AC9
D44? AC9D44. That's right? Okay. Got it.
I sent you an email last night and it said you got it, but I just wanted to double check.
there's no days.
Oh, AC9. Thank you for checking it. D44. What's your last name?
Smith?
No, I didn't get it. What is it? Okay, I'll get yours in a second. What's your last name?
Razak, I sent you an email.
What is it?
Razak, R-A-Z-Z-A-Q.
Are you registered in the other class?
No, actually, I moved over to this class. I don't know on my list.
It wouldn't be on here yet. Okay, give me the number and then I'll write down your name.
It's B35-16-8.
B35168.
35168. Yep.
Okay, good. And R?
R-A-Z-Z-A-Q.
Z-A-Q. First name?
First name is Shahid. S-H-A-H-I-D.
S-H.
A-H-I-D.
I-D.
S-41.
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
That number, I just have to have one on there. Okay, got it. Adolfo, bravo.
Yes.
Okay. ID, the device ID.
117161.
117161. Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
What was it? Smith?
Smith, yep.
Kylie.
Yep.
Okay.
11718 and then F.
18F.
Uh-huh.
Okay, got it.
Alright,
Okay.
thank you.
Hi.
Alright.
Are you? Wait, just come over to my office. I'll be there in a second. Or you can walk over with me if you want.
Okay, I'm gonna go. How long are you gonna be there?
At least an hour. I have office hours right now.
Okay. I'm gonna go do my ACS meeting.
Hi.
And then I'll be
I'm so excited. I still hope they have the jar baby next week.
Oh, they do. They have 2 or 3. They have-
Question for you, because midterms for the anatomy lab final is like right before spring break.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to make flight arrangements. Do we need to? There will be no open lab, I assume, after. But on that Friday, do I need to be there for the midterm?
They want you to be there for the midterm.
Okay,
Yeah,
then I'll just
they
make
do.
my flight for
Mhm.
Friday.
It helps because cheating.
Then my friend's a nurse at NCC. The patient didn't make it, but that's the cerebral spinal fluid. It's supposed to be, clear coming out of the brain. Yeah, it's insane. They didn't make it. Needless to say.
Gosh. That at the U?
Yeah.
Oh, who's? Because I was at NCC at the U. So I had brain thing over the break, and so I probably know your person. Yeah.
Sure, Amy Kime.
I don't know.
Tall, really pretty, big boobs.
No.
Has like shaved.
I didn't see her.
You
Yeah.
ever, what the hell?
I'll tell you about it
Yeah,
sometime.
please do.
Yeah, I'm fine now.
I'm really glad you are. Did you get my email?
What's your last name?
Sopco.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I got yours. Yeah. CF9. Yeah, I got you.
Great, thank you.
Anybody else? Quicker?
I was thinking the quiz is gonna be today.
I put it off because so many people hadn't registered their clickers.
Okay, the problem is my son, he has tournament and we will go to Nevada for his tournament. So I will not be allowed to come on Friday. In this case, I lost my 5 points, right?
No, that's not 5 points. That's only part of the points for the... You're going to have 3 quizzes before the first test. And all 3 of them together are 5 points.
But I still lost my points.
You'll probably lose 2 points or something. Yeah.
Still 2 points.
Yeah.
Big deal.